Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. Many people expect improvements in technology over the next few years, but fewer people are optimistic about improvements in the economy. Especially in Europe, there's a narrative that productivity has stalled, that the welfare state is overstretched, and that the regions of the world where innovation will be rewarded are the US and China, although there are lots of disagreements about which of these two countries will gain the upper hand. To discuss these topics, our guest in this episode is Carl Benedikt Frey, the Dieter Schwarz Associate Professor of AI and Work at the Oxford Internet Institute. Carl is also a fellow at Mansfield College, University of Oxford, and is director of the Future of Work programme and Oxford Martin Citi Fellow at the Oxford Martin School. Carl's new book has the ominous title, How Progress Ends. The subtitle is Technology, Innovation and the Fate of Nations. A central premise of the book is that our ability to think clearly about the possibilities for progress and stagnation today is enhanced by looking backward at the rise and fall of nations around the globe over the past 1,000 years. The book contains fascinating analysis of how countries at various times made significant progress and at other times stagnated. The book also considers what we might deduce about the possible futures of different economies worldwide. Carol, welcome to the London Futurists podcast.
It's good to be with you.
Thanks for joining us, Carl.
Carl, let's start with an example from earlier in your book, which is prohibition, the historical period in the United States when access to alcohol was prohibited. So far in my life, I have tended to think of that policy as simply being weird. But as you point out, almost every economist at the time was in favour of introducing it. What were they thinking, and what did they miss?
Well, that's a good question. I think economists of the time were generally bent a bit towards social engineering. I think it's also fair to say that they had a view of the economy that wasn't very dynamic. They thought of static efficiency, and by that economists mean how do you allocate resources at a given point in time to make sure you get the most out of the economy as you possibly can. This was a time of mass production. The Ford factory system had just been developed and was arguably at its early peak. And economists thought that, alcohol obviously is going to make people less likely to turn up at work. And it's going to make people less likely to be able to manage the speed of the factory system. It is going to slow people down. It is going to cause social problems in people's communities, etc. And they underestimated the importance for saloons as a place where people met. Many saloons catered to particular professions. And this was a place where people met after work, discussed ideas, and knowledge were transmitted. And so what you saw as a consequence of that was a decline in what economists call dynamic efficiency. That's what's driving improvements in living standards over the long run. It's about innovation. And as those social networks were disrupted by prohibition, you see a very dramatic decline in patenting as a consequence, not just among teams, but also among solo inventors who were less exposed to new ideas as a result of prohibition.
Carl, I think I've read that prohibition was a big feminist issue because there was a serious problem, genuine problem, with men going to saloons and then going home and beating 10 bells out of their wives. There was a lot of women's groups which were arguing forcefully for prohibition, and it did actually improve that problem to some degree. Of course, it did a lot of damage in other ways later.
And I think that's fair to say. There are all sorts of consequences of prohibition. One other consequence was the switch away to liquor and to stronger spirits, and then cocktails emerged as a consequence. And so prohibition by no means reduced consumption of alcohol, or I haven't seen much evidence to suggest that, but it shifted what people were drinking. Milton Friedman used to make the same case about drug prohibition, suggesting that if we hadn't banned cocaine, we wouldn't have seen crack. I don't know whether that's true or not, but you see something similar happening during Prohibition. People move to less healthy alternatives, which are sold in the black market.
The saloons are a bit similar to coffee shops, I guess. Imagine if all the coffee shops were banned. Many aspects of business would run less smoothly. The parts which are well understood in advance would go well, but reaching out to new contacts, exploring new ideas, which often happens in coffee shops, would be set back. And so this distinction you make between static efficiency and dynamic efficiency actually made a lot of sense to me.
Absolutely. There's nothing about saloons in particular that is important to innovation, but that was at the time the place where people were meeting, and in Europe, even before then, coffee shops were the place where intellectuals met and discussed ideas. They didn't gather the same prominence on the other side of the Atlantic, but the point is simply that these social networks matter for innovation.
Let's look at another historical transition, which was the Sputnik moment, the original Sputnik moment back in 1957, where various commentators were alarmed, very alarmed. Arthur C. Clarke, who, as well as being a science fiction writer, had a pretty good track record overall for forecasting the future. He declared that the day of Sputnik's launch was the day the United States became a second-rate power. And Edward Teller, known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, he said that Sputnik was a greater defeat for the United States than Pearl Harbor. So why didn't the USSR go on to leave the USA in the dust?
So to be clear, the United States was in no risky position of being overtaken by the Soviet Union in economic terms. In per capita terms, the Soviet Union were very far behind, even during their peak. But they did create some noteworthy technological innovations, particularly in the military domain and particularly in space. But just as astounding as Sputnik itself is the fact that in the USSR, nothing like the telecommunications industry that emerged in the United States ever evolved. They completely lacked the decentralized preconditions for innovation and technology to diffuse and find commercial use. And so the Soviet Union, to be completely fair, deserves perhaps some credit for achieving 6% growth per year for a period of around 4 decades. But at the same time, most of that growth was confined to heavy industry. Much of that focused on the military domain, meaning that not very much of that growth translated into improvements in people's lives. Moreover, I think it's fair to say that while Soviet institutions were decent in taking Western technology, taking advantage, for example, of the Ford Motor Company's open door policy, transplanting the automotive industry to the Soviet Union, and then giving that high priority and scale up production, it did very well in that for some time. And when you have multiple factories producing similar things, then you can benchmark and you can say, hey, this factory is producing more than you are. Why is that? And you can hold factory managers accountable. That's much harder in a system when radical innovation is needed, because by definition, that means dealing with novelty. That means that you can't benchmark. That means that you can't hold factory managers, leaders of state-owned enterprises accountable to the same degree. And so what happened is that when the computer revolution arrived, the mass production system around the world crumbled, and the Soviet Union was no exception to that. But there was no mechanism by which the USSR could facilitate experimentation without pulling the rug on the entire system. And so it eventually ran into diminishing returns and collapsed.
We can't talk about a book entitled How Progress Ends without addressing the elephant in the room, which is the claims that many people are making that America is currently in the process of losing its democracy and becoming a dictatorship, which sounds alarmist, but there are many people saying that Congress has ceased to function and become entirely supine. The Supreme Court is increasingly backing Trump in whatever he wants. It's packed with loyalists like Alito and Clarence Thomas. Judge Roberts doesn't appear to be behaving any differently. The ICE police force is apparently the biggest police force in the world now and is behaving like brown shirts, according to many people. Trump's tariffs are illegal, but going ahead. He's sacking officials in organizations where he's not supposed to have the power to do that. He's attacking judges in the lower courts, which are currently the main brake on his expanding powers. And he's invading democratic cities, despite the fact that the crime rate is often higher elsewhere. He seems to be practicing to abolish the midterm elections. And we've had, in the last couple of days, the quite extraordinary sight of Ezra Klein, who's a very moderate columnist in the New York Times, arguing that the Democrats should not pass the budget that's due for renewal in order to stop the US government functioning, to stop this progress towards dictatorship. I read a while ago that no country, having lost its democracy, has ever got it back democratically. It's only ever got it back through war or through societal collapse. So the arguable march towards authoritarian dictatorship in America is very, very serious for America and for the rest of the world. What's your take on this? Do you think this is a very, very serious situation? And what would be the impact on the rest of the world if America lost its democracy?
Well, it's certainly a very serious situation. I don't think there is any question about that. I'm not in a position to tell whether the United States is going to slide into authoritarianism. Term limits still apply. Whether Trump will seek a second term or not, I still don't think we know that. But even if there is a relatively peaceful transition, a lot of damage has already been done. The Trump administration taking golden shares in Intel, looking to take shares potentially in a wide set of companies. What will be the consequences of that? Well, certainly there will be much higher barriers to entry for competitors because a government that has a stake in a firm doesn't want it to fail. Even if the Democrats win the next election, they may do it on a very different platform, more left-leaning. They may look to have other political priorities that are not just economic either. I don't know much about what's happening on the ground around Trump's police force, the border patrols, but I find those reports tremendously concerning as well. What I can say with some certainty is that the United States right now is undermining every single aspect of what has made it an inventive and dynamic economy in the past. First pillar for the US technological dynamism has been immigration and institutions that attract skilled people. University funding is currently being cut. Visa restrictions are steadily tightening. At the same time, we're seeing, as I mentioned, these golden shares being taken, a lot of cronyism with regard to tariffs and tariff exemptions as well, which makes it harder for firms to navigate this increasingly complex system. American firms are increasingly being shielded from foreign competition as a check at a time when domestic competition is deteriorating. And we're not seeing anything like the response that we saw in response to the Soviet Union, with ARPA being set up, a lot of agencies trying to spur innovation, arguably with mixed success, but at least with a sense of urgency. We're not seeing anything like what we saw in the 1980s when Japan was allegedly about to overtake the United States and was making significant strides, not just in cars, but also in semiconductors and consumer electronics more broadly. And I think there are lessons to be learned from that. Why, in the end of the day, was it that the United States actually maintained its technological leadership while Japan ended up stagnating in the 1980s? Big part of that, I think, has to do with competition and dynamism and competition policy. The antitrust suit against IBM essentially forced the company to unbundle hardware from software and made it feasible for firms like Microsoft to enter the market. The breakup of AT&T meant that when the National Science Foundation released ARPANET, the predecessor to the modern internet, to the world. There was no boardroom that could bottleneck the technology if it saw no immediate benefit of the internet, and the commercial applications were lagging at the time. And then finally, to undercut Japan's production advantage, the United States integrated with Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China, and so neutralized Japan's cost advantages, built these global supply chains. And right now, America is undermining all of these advantages that it previously had. It's moving much more towards economic nationalism, trying to prop up national champions. If there's one thing that can be learned from Chinese industrial policy, is that if you want to do it, you seed a number of firms and let them compete against each other. Sectors of the Chinese economy, which are dynamic, are sectors where you have fierce competition, where you have one state of the enterprise, one national champion. There's not much in terms of innovation happening there. And so, if anything, the United States is learning the wrong lessons from China.
And why do you think, given that Wall Street appears pretty much unconcerned about what's going on? NASDAQ and the S&P keep hitting new highs, and leaders of large American companies, including the big tech firms, are either completely quiet or actively wooing and praising Trump. These people must know that the policies will have the effects that you describe. Are they just scared of him, or are they making a misjudgment?
I don't know is the answer, but I do know that in Nazi Germany or in fascist Italy, as long as you stayed on the right side of the debate, you can make a lot of money as a business. For most firms, having a rule of law is a good thing. And for most companies, having access to global markets is a good thing. But if you have to choose between ending up on the right side of Trump or the wrong side of Trump, then for most business leaders, it's probably more economically beneficial to end up on the right side. I suspect that that's part of the reason why many are not speaking up. Regarding the stock markets, it is and remains a puzzle to me, though I do note that every time Trump threatens higher tariffs, the stock market tanks, and every time he rolls back on those previous pledges, it surges. So one interpretation is that markets are just not taking this too seriously. I think that is taking too short a view. I think that a lot of damage to American institutions have already been done. I don't think that the levels of tariffs that we currently have are completely unmanageable, but I don't think they're going to be rolled back anytime soon either. They tend to stick. And so I wonder if markets are not making a mistake there.
So you're pointing out various problems with what America is doing, losing its ability to have decentralized radical innovation. Does that mean that China is going to jump ahead and be the leading economy in the world? There are other issues as to what's happening in China as well, which deserve attention.
So if there is some encouraging news for the United States, it's that its competitors is not doing particularly well either. If we go back and look at Chinese productivity performance over the past 10 to 15 years, it turned into negative territory after the Great Recession. It's remained stagnant ever since. Chinese income per capita is roughly at a fifth of where American income per capita stands right now. And so they're plateauing at a relatively low level, also compared to other East Asian economies like South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. The real estate sector is, by some estimates, about a third of the total economy at the moment. That's not a great situation to be in. There are only so many roads and buildings that you can construct, and China has already run into serious troubles on that dimension. Moreover, China is undercutting much of the model that actually made it successful. China grow rich by opening up and having local governors and provincial leaders competing against each other for better jobs within the party system. And the way you got a better job was by delivering better growth. This created sort of an implicit contract whereby investors could more or less assume that their investment would be safe because it was in the provincial governor's interest to continue to attract investment and to climb the hierarchy of the party. Unlike the Soviet Union, where you had to pull the rug under the entire system for experimentation to happen, in China you could have localized experimentation. That yielded some very impressive results. But more and more power are now being centralized in Beijing, in the hands of Xi Jinping in particular. And as other concerns are taking precedent over growth, that means that you have to instrumentalize firms not just to pursue growth and profit, but also political objectives. Private and foreign invested firms that have been the drivers of Chinese innovation and productivity, they're not very keen on pursuing political objectives. They want to pursue business objectives, and that means that state-owned enterprises, which have been lagging by every single metric, have to play a growing role again in the economy, and I think that's going to be a real drag on the Chinese economy going forward.
One statistic in your book which took me by surprise is that China doesn't actually make much money from licensing its intellectual property. So in 2023, when the United States received $126 billion in royalties from the rest of the world, China received only $11 billion. So that's an order of magnitude less. So China isn't at the cutting edge of innovation, in that statistic at least.
It is at the cutting edge in some domains, and it's not that different from Japan, actually. They have a lot of process knowledge, and so they can produce solar panels and batteries and EVs at very low cost. They're doing well in those particular domains. But overall, I can't think of a single drug that has been pioneered by the Chinese. When it comes to AI, DeepSeek was impressive, but it built off American efforts. And if you look at the patent statistics, if your patent covers a valuable technology, you will pay maintenance fees to uphold them. Most Chinese inventors are not willing to pay those maintenance fees, suggesting that they're not covering valuable technologies. If you incentivize, for example, local officials to pursue patenting as an objective, well, what you get is a lot of junk patents, because you can build either a strong patent with many different claims, so you can split it up into 10 different patents with single weak claims. It seems that Chinese inventors are going for the latter, and as a result, you're getting patent inflation, but not particularly valuable patents.
To what extent is AI going to change all of this? What we've been talking about so far is the world without much impact from AI. We talked about the impact of the computer age, the computer revolution. But some people argue that many of the former trends are going to be blown out of the water as people adapt to AI. What do you think about that?
We've been sold this narrative for a while now that if you just amass a lot of data and amass a lot of compute, you're going to lead in AI. The jury is to some degree still out on that, but I think the scaling narrative has suffered some setbacks in recent years. We saw from 2019 to 2023 models being scaled up by 10,000x, and we were not seeing much meaningful performance improvements on reasoning tests like ArcAGI. But then all of a sudden, we have new methods, we have new tweaks. The latest reasoning models are doing much better, although by no means very impressive. And so still, I think AI has a resilience challenge. It does extremely well in static environments, does less well when circumstances change. We all know of AlphaGo beating the world champion back in 2016. Fewer people know that back in 2023, human amateurs using standard laptops, exploiting state-of-the-art Go programs to positions that they would not have previously encountered in trading, beats the best Go programs relatively easy. If the world was just a static distribution of events, you could probably brute force it, but it's not. The world is changing all the time. Right now, we don't have AI that is capable of adjusting to that. And I think that's a matter of innovation and discovery. And so ultimately, the question you're asking is who's most likely to drive these innovations? Is it the United States or is it China? My hunch is that in China, you have to build a lot of political capital if you want to stay afloat. So if you're DeepSeek, you can fly under the radar for some time as long as you serve national objectives. But party priorities can change with the weather. And so to secure your firm, you have to invest a lot in political capital that could otherwise be devoted towards innovation to build these political connections. So that means that barriers to entry are quite high, higher than they are in the United States. And I think that's giving China a real disadvantage. That said, China has gone to embrace open source recently. Local state governments are doing that as a result of being behind in generative AI. So there is clearly a scenario where China pursues the open source trajectory and where the US government takes golden shares in some now leading AI companies and props them up. That could change the balance.
Carl, way back in 2013, you and a colleague, Michael Osborne, wrote an article called The Future of Employment, in which you said that 47% of current US jobs were highly susceptible to automation. And perhaps against your preferences, you became a standard bearer for the idea that technological unemployment was coming and in the not too distant future. Where do you stand on that now? Do you think technological unemployment is coming? And if so, when?
Part of the question is where? Back then, we were looking at technologies that would automate entire jobs. Many of the jobs that we considered to be automatable were in things like transportation and logistics, and I still think there's very likely to be significant disruption in those particular domains. We haven't seen it yet. Obviously, most of the debate today centers around generative AI. To me, generative AI in its current form is more than anything else reducing barriers to entry in professional services and content creation. So it's a little bit like what Uber did to taxi services. With GPS technology, knowing the name of every street in Oxford was no longer a particularly valuable skill. And then with the Uber app, matching supply and demand, anybody with a driver's license could get into his or her car and top up their income on the side. What you saw as a result of that was more competition and incumbent drivers taking a pay cut of around 10% as a consequence. Now, obviously, a key difference with professional services is that those jobs are traded. We have a lot of evidence showing that in writing, in coding, in a repetitive customer service, novices and low-skilled workers benefit the most in terms of productivity gains in those settings. And that makes sense. Dostoevsky's novels would not have been any better if ChatGPT had been accessible to him. Whereas for academics that can't write, it's much more beneficial. Even within the same firm, like Google or the big four auditors, the salaries of a worker at a company in Manila or in Cairo or in Bangalore, it's like an order of magnitude lower than in New York City or London or Paris. And if you think of generative AI reducing the productivity difference between those workers, well, we should see a lot more activity in professional services shift towards places like Manila. I think that that is a wave that is likely to come for London and New York and many of these cities. These high-income jobs, they support a lot of jobs in the local service economy, whether it's the salaries of yoga instructors or waitresses and waiters and hairdressers, etc. I think that we will have significant disruption as a consequence of this, but it also means that many more jobs will shift somewhere else. We're not destroying jobs on a global basis, but we're seeing dramatic shifts which can lead to technological employment in certain pockets of the economy.
That's an interesting take. So you think we're not going to automate all jobs, we're just going to move them all to Manila. But there's an argument that as we continue to develop AIs and they continue to get smarter and smarter, timing can be debated. Maybe it's slowed down, maybe it hasn't. But eventually they will get to the point, unless there's a silicon ceiling that they can't go beyond, where they can do everything that we can do for money. Would you accept that that logic means that at some point technological automation will happen? You'll have a fully automated economy in which there basically aren't any jobs for humans. Do you see that as a possibility? And if so, when?
I'm not sure if there's a future where there is no work to be done for humans. I see that direction is a possibility. I don't see any reason why machine could never, ever get as good as humans across the board. But I think even in that economy, it would be tremendously disruptive. There's no doubt about it. But the labor share of the economy wouldn't go to zero. There are more professional chess players in the world today than there was when Deep Blue beat Kasparov. There's no reason in principle why I should go and have a yoga class at my local yoga studio. I could just watch people doing it on YouTube at home and do it in my home. And still people go to yoga studios. A lot of this stuff will depend on consumer preferences. I still suspect that humans will compete in a variety of domains because we don't really care if AI outperforms us in certain activities. There will be quite a few domains where we, for various reasons, prefer being around other humans. There will be some ceremonial things and some things that are regulated, which means that there are still certain human jobs. I still think, even with those caveats, that it would be a tremendously disruptive event, but I don't think the labor share of income will go to zero as a consequence.
So let's draw some of this together. Imagine that the UK Prime Minister came to you and said he needs your help in navigating changes that need to be made in the UK's productivity, the UK's economic well-being. What would you recommend? Are you one of the people who's excited by the idea of mission economy, for example, that we should be picking moonshots or the equivalent of Manhattan projects and getting behind them? Or is there more that needs to be done?
So I think my first bit of advice would be to re-enter the European Union, which means that I would never be asked to begin with. So your question is probably somewhat redundant in that regard. But I think a key challenge facing Europe is that firms struggle to scale. It's just too expensive. It's particularly expensive when it comes to services. So the IMF estimates that regulatory barriers to service trade in Europe amount to 110% tariff. So the Trump Liberation Day tariffs self-imposed. Britain would need to be within the European Union to have an impact on those barriers to try to harmonize the digital and service markets inside the European Union. And I think without that happening, not much is going to happen to revive European growth. On mission-led stuff, sure, the Rad Lab achieved its mission of advancing radar technology. The Manhattan Project achieved its mission of developing the bomb before Nazi Germany. The Apollo Project put the man on the moon. So if there are missions that we want to pursue, which are well defined, and the only way we can mobilize resources to do them, I'm not against that in principle. But if you think that that's going to revive Europe, I think you're very much mistaken. The so-called mission economy, as far as I could tell, had very little impact on the American post-war prosperity. Most of the technological innovations that drove American growth in the post-war period were invented in the 19th century, then sort of perfected in the early 20th century. American productivity growth began accelerating in the 1920s, long before the mission economy, as it's sometimes called, emerged. And more broadly, post-war growth was very broad-based. Europe closed the gap to the US in this period. Japan closed the gap. Even the economies behind the Iron Curtain closed the gap to some degree. So there was nothing specific to the US economy in this period that can explain this. I think the best explanation for post-war prosperity is that there were 2 world wars. There was a lot of built-up technological knowledge before the war that hasn't been released into the world and hadn't proliferated across the American economy, and that's the driver of post-war prosperity. So if you think that mission economy is going to solve our economic problems, I think you're mistaken. But if there are missions, such as solving climate change, that are worthy missions, there's clearly a case for them.
So the mission for the UK should be to rejoin the EU, and the mission for the EU should be to complete the single market. I think that's a pretty good way to sum up what needs to happen on this side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, I could have shortened my answer by quite a bit.
As a historian, you must be aware of when public mood changed unexpectedly. The things which had previously been beyond any expectation, things outside of the so-called Overton window, then became acceptable and even popular. You said in your earlier answer that nobody's ever going to ask you for advice because it's going to go against the dogma that we have to remain outside the EU. But aren't there scenarios in which there might be a change in attitude? There might be a new political party that says, let's reverse Brexit. There might be other changes. Do you have any parallels to draw on or any scenarios in mind for such a thing?
It's certainly true that times of crisis have often sparked reform. Prussia's defeat to Napoleon sparked the Stein-Hardenberg reforms. Disaster in the Crimean War sparked reforms in both Russia and Britain. Clearly, today, Argentina is going through some sweeping reforms that's been very much enabled by a very long period of very significant crisis. So yes, I do think that it's possible. I'm not sure that I see the sense of urgency in either Britain or Europe that will be needed for that at the moment. I'm not sure if I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful.
Not optimistic, but hopeful. I think that is a very good way to draw this to a close. Carl, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I'll end by recommending people check out your book. I found it fascinating as a history buff, but also fascinating as a futurist to imagine how these patterns that were established in the past might play out in various ways in the years and decades ahead. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.